This picture explains our entire economy. It shows how a small, agile force can defeat a bloated, inefficient giant. The image is a metaphor for a conflict that has defined the last 150 years. It is a war fought not with weapons, but with technologies, with organizational structures, and with ideas. On one side stands the giant, the conventional economy of mass production. It's a system of immense scale, high overhead, and bureaucratic complexity. A titan built and sustained by a close partnership with the state. On the other side is a guerrilla force, a decentralized, low overhead, and resilient alternative. It's an economy of small-scale producers, agile networks, and human-centered technology. This is how the giant came to dominate the modern world. It's about a wrong turn in history, a moment when humanity had the chance to build a more humane and efficient economy, and instead chose the path of centralized power and artificial scale. It's a story of how the giant captured the very tools that should have led to its demise, and how the guerrilla insurgency, after a century in the shadows, is now rising again. To understand this conflict, we must go back to a fork in the road of industrial history. The historian Lewis Mumford identified three great technological phases. The first he called the Eotechnic Era. This was the age of wind, water, and wood, a world of skilled artisans and free towns using clever clockwork machinery powered by water wheels and windmills. It was a decentralized, sophisticated, and ecologically balanced system that laid the groundwork for modern mechanics. This Eotechnic phase was displaced by the Paleotechnic Era, which we typically call the Industrial Revolution. This was the age of coal, iron, and steam. Its defining institution was the factory, a creation born from the logic of the steam engine. Because early steam engines were inefficient and powerful, they demanded the production to be concentrated in one place. Dozens of machines were tethered to a single, massive prime mover by a force of belts and shafts. This technological constraint, combined with the militaristic culture inherited from the mining and armaments industries, created the large, centralized factories of the 19th century. This was the birth of the giant. But then at the end of the 19th century, a new technological wave arrived. Mumford called it the Neotechnic phase. This was the age of electricity, light alloys, and chemistry. Its core invention, the electric motor, was revolutionary because it severed the connection between the power source and the machine. For the first time since the steam engine, power could be delivered anywhere. It could drive a massive industrial lathe or a small household appliance. This technology was the natural heir to the Eotechnic phase. It offered a future free from the constraints of the factory system. Thinkers like Peter Kropotkin and William Morris saw the potential immediately. With small, efficient electric motors, manufacturing could be decentralized. Production could return to small workshops, to local communities, even to the individual homes. The rigid, centralized factory, with its immense overhead and scale, was now technologically obsolete. The Neotechnic Revolution held the promise of a new world, a guerrilla economy of flexible, small-scale production for local needs. It was the moment the giant could have been slain. So if the factory was now technologically obsolete, why did it get bigger instead of disappearing? The Neotechnic Revolution was aborted. The new liberating technologies were not used to create a new decentralized system. Instead, they were captured by the old system. The giant took the electric motor and simply used it to make the Paleotechnic factory bigger and more efficient. It was, as Mumford described it, a cultural pseudomorph. A new substance forced into the old, dead structure of a previous age. The body of the giant remained animated by a new and more powerful heart. The central question of our story is, how did this happen? How was the guerrilla revolution suppressed and the giant's reign prolonged? The answer is that the giant did not win on its own merit. It had a powerful ally, the state. The triumph of the centralized mass production corporation in the United States was not the result of superior efficiency or market competition. It was the direct result of a series of massive and sustained interventions by the government, which artificially created an environment where only the giants could survive. The most critical intervention was the creation of a national transportation system. The vast integrated railroad network that spanned the continent in the late 19th century was not a natural market development. It was a state-sponsored mega project. The federal government gave the railroad companies more than 175 million acres in land grants and subsidized their construction with millions in government bonds. This colossal investment created a high-volume, high-speed, and artificially cheap transportation grid. As the historian Alfred Chandler, the chief theorist of the managerial corporation, himself admitted, this infrastructure was the absolute prerequisite for mass production. First came a national system of distribution, with wholesalers and retailers who could move goods across the country. Only then did large-scale manufacturing to supply the system become possible. The state, in effect, aggregated the markets of thousands of local communities into a single national market. It created an artificial ecosystem to which the large mass production corporation was uniquely adapted. Without this subsidized transportation, American industry would have developed along a completely different path. A multitude of smaller regional economies served by flexible producers for local markets, 100 guerrilla economies. The railroads did more than just create the national market, they actively shaped it in favor of their large clients. They instituted a policy of secret rebates and rate discrimination. A large, powerful shipper like John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil could negotiate a massive discount, giving it a decisive advantage over many smaller competitors. Meanwhile, a farmer shipping his grains a short distance might pay a far higher rate per mile. The railroads, themselves high overhead, capital-intensive giants, had a powerful incentive to stabilize their own revenue by stabilizing the market share of their biggest customers. They became the enforcers of monopoly, using their controls over transportation to pick winners and losers in every other industry. But cheap transportation and favorable rates were not enough. To truly operate on a national scale, the giant corporation needed the rules of the game to be written in its own favor. The second pillar of the giant's armor was the legal system. In the mid to late 19th century, the American legal framework was fundamentally reshaped to serve the needs of the national corporation. The Supreme Court's 1886 decision in Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad was a landmark moment. By designating the corporation as a legal person under the 14th Amendment, the court gave these entities powerful protections against state and local regulation. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, the courts used this power to strike down local laws designed to protect communities from corporate harms. Health and safety regulations, environmental protections, and labor laws were all overturned as violations of the corporation's due process rights. The federal judiciary became a kind of super legislature, creating a unified national legal space where corporations could operate with minimal interference from the democratic will of the local populations. This centralized legal regime was as essential to the corporate giant as the centralized railroad system. How do you eliminate competition when your product is easily replicated? You make replication illegal. This was the true purpose of the modern patent system. The third and perhaps most potent weapon in the giant's legal arsenal was patent law. We are often told that patents protect small inventors. The historical record shows the opposite. In the new science-based industries of the late 19th century, electrical, chemical, and telephone, patents were systematically used as tools of corporate warfare to build monopolies and destroy competition. The electrical industry was consolidated into two giants, General Electric and Westinghouse, largely through strategic acquisition and pooling of patents. The electrical system was consolidated into two giants, General Electric and Westinghouse, largely through the strategic acquisition and pooling of patents. Each company amassed a portfolio of patents so vast that it became impossible for anyone to manufacture electrical equipment without risking an infringement suit. The endless litigation became so costly that in 1896, the two giants simply agreed to pool their patents and divide the market between them, creating a formal cartel. The story of the telephone industry is even more stark. The Bell Company, which would become AT&T, used its initial patents as a foundation, but its long-term strategy, in the words of its manager, Theodore Bell, was to surround the business with 1,001 little patents and inventions. The company established a massive research and development department with the explicit goal of patenting every conceivable improvement or auxiliary device. This patent thicket was designed to prevent any potential competitor from entering the field, even long after their original foundational patents had expired. It was a strategy of preemptive conquest, using intellectual property to acquire an entire technological frontier. This pattern was repeated across the economy. The modern American chemical industry was born when the US government seized German chemical patents during World War I and distributed them to firms like DuPont. In industry after industry, patents were used to create what one lawyer at the time called the only legal form of absolute monopoly. They formed corporations to form enforceable cartels, fixing prices, limiting output, and eliminating the threat of competition. They were not the actions of scrappy entrepreneurs in a free market. This was the deliberate construction of a protected oligopolistic system made possible by government-granted privilege. The climax of this story, the moment the wrong turn became permanent, was not a single event. It was the synthesis of all these forces. It was the moment the Neotechnic promise of decentralized electric power production was decisively crushed by the Paleotechnic reality of the State-Corporate Nexus. The new technology, which should have empowered the Guerrilla, was instead conscripted into the army of the giant. The flexible electric motor was bolted to the floor of the centralized factory. The innovation potential of science was locked behind the walls of the corporate patent office. The democratic promise of local control was overridden by a federal legal system designed to protect corporate power. The immediate result was the 20th century we now know, a world dominated by a few massive and vertically integrated corporations. It was an economy of unprecedented scale, but it also created its own profound inefficiencies. It required enormous overhead costs in management and marketing simply to coordinate its own complexity. It generated immense waste through planned obsolescence, a strategy required to maintain constant consumption, and it externalized its true cost of pollution, resource depletion, and fragile supply chains onto the public. The logic of mass production demanded that the giant corporations control their environment, smoothing out demand and guaranteeing the consumption of their enormous output. This led to the rise of mass marketing and advertising and consumer credit, all designed to manage the population into consuming what the factories produced. It was a system that could only survive as long as the state continued to subsidize its inputs, managing its markets, and protect it from competition. This brings us to the legacy of this hidden history, and back to our opening image of the gorilla and the giant. For a century, the giant reigned supreme. The Paleotechnic Order, a system of centralized control and high overhead, seemed to be the only possible path for a modern society. Both Western corporate capitalism and Soviet state communism, for all their ideological differences, shared this fundamental belief in giantism and central planning. They were two faces of the same Paleotechnic coin. But what if this giant's victory was never total? What if the guerrilla insurgency was simply waiting for a new set of tools? The principle of decentralized, small-scale, flexible production survives in the margins, and today, a new technological revolution is fanning those embers into a flame. The development of desktop manufacturing tools like 3D printers and CNC machines, the rise of the open-source design communities, and the growth of peer-to-peer networks are creating the foundation for what Kevin Carson calls the Homebrew Industrial Revolution. This is the Neotechnic promise, deferred for a century, finally coming to fruition. It's a new guerrilla economy emerging from within the shell of the old, bloated system. It's an economy of agility where production can be scaled to meet immediate, local needs without the waste of mass production and long-distance distribution. It's an economy of resilience, where decentralized networks are less vulnerable to system shocks than centralized hierarchies. The story of how the giant captured the first Neotechnic revolution matters because it proves that our economic destiny is not predetermined by technology. It's shaped by power and by politics. The corporate-dominated world we inhabit is not the product of an invisible hand or natural law. It was a choice made by powerful interests who used the state to build the system that served them. Understanding this history reveals that a different choice is now before us. The conflict between the giant and the guerrilla continues. The centralized, high-overhead world of the 20th century is facing a crisis of its own making, weighed down by its own complexity and inefficiency. The future belongs to the lean, the adaptable, the decentralized. The future, it seems, belongs to the guerrilla.